This episode has been brought to you by My Extraordinary Productions. Don't go at it alone. Let's work on your next film together. Click the link in the description to learn more. Hi everyone, this is the first part of a 4-part series. This is Cinematography for Non Cinematographers, and we're going to start off by talking about cameras. The first hyphlife vlog I released was actually about whether you should go with a phone or whether you should go with an actual dedicated camera. And both have pros and cons, which you can watch the video to discover more of, but the short version is that there are certain things you can do with a camera that you can't do with a phone, and if you're an actor, it makes a lot of sense to have a dedicated camera so that your phone can act as a phone and you can have your reader speak to you on your phone. So let's talk about resolution. There's HD, which is high definition, there's full HD, and then there's 4K, and then there's all sorts of other things like 8K and standard definition. What does all of this mean? When it comes to resolution, I like to explain it like a mosaic, in that a mosaic is made up of a bunch of pieces, a bunch of colored tiles. And the more color tiles you have and the smaller they are, the more detail you can put into your final product. Standard definition is usually 480 pixels. It offers a really good picture, but we have high definition for a reason. High definition offers an increase in quality, and it starts at 720 pixels. Most videos on YouTube are full HD, which is 1080 pixels. And finally, you get to 4K and 8K, which, you guessed it, 4,000 pixels or 8,000 pixels respectively. The difference between standard definition and high definition is pretty apparent. The high definition stuff tends to look a lot better because there's just more detail that we can see with our eyes. But there is a point where the human eye can't really detect the difference between 720 pixels and 1080 pixels, or the difference between 1080 and 4000 pixels. So where does this come in? The human eye can't really detect the difference between 1080 pixels on a computer screen and 4000 pixels on a computer screen because the computer only has so many of its own pixels. But if you know this thing is going to be on a giant movie screen, you're going to be a little more likely to shoot in 4K. Another advantage of shooting something in 4K or 8K is that because you have more pixels that you're working with, and because the human eye can't really tell the difference between 4000 pixels and 1000 pixels, you are able to crop your images in a little and reframe shots after the fact. There are a couple of cons about going with the 4K and 8K cameras. The first one being that since people know they can crop in later, they can sometimes be a little lazy about how they frame their shots, and then that leads to problems later on. But a more immediate issue might be the fact that 4K just takes up a lot more space than 1080 pixels would. Since 4K takes up more space than 1080, 4K also takes a lot more time to process, and editing can be a little more challenging. Basically, this is a long-winded way of saying if your camera already shoots in 1080, you don't really need to upgrade yet. Let's talk about your frame rate. Your frame rate is pretty much just the number of pictures per second that your camera is taking. The really, really old black and white film from like 1910 tends to be shot right around 12 to 16 frames per second. Most feature-length cinematic films are shot in 24 frames per second. A lot of TV shows are shot in 30 frames per second, and eventually you get 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second, and then they just keep going up beyond that. If you wanted to show a time lapse, you would have a very, very low frame rate of 1 picture per second, or 1 picture per minute or hour or even day, depending on what your project is. Alternatively, if you wanted to slow down your footage, you would use a very high frame rate, like 120 frames per second, which could be slowed down to a quarter of its speed, or you would have something even higher than that. Personally, if I'm watching a video that is supposed to be a narrative and it is in 60 frames per second or higher, it doesn't look right to me. It looks like a bunch of real people pretending to do something, which, like, that's what this is, really. Depth of field is basically everything that is in focus and everything else would be out of focus. You can have a very narrow depth of field where only my eyes and my nose are in focus and everything else is a little blurry, or you could have a very wide depth of field where everything is pretty easy to see. If you don't want to think about it at all, your depth of field should be on the wider side, but you can do a lot of really artistic things if you're willing to work with a shallow depth of field. You can simulate bad vision, you can simulate blurriness, you can simulate otherworldliness, or you can just change focus from one thing to another thing in the same shot. So now that you know what your resolution is, your frame rate, and your depth of field is, now we can start composing our shots, and an easy place to start is with the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds basically means you divide your screen into 3 columns and 3 rows, and you compose your shot around that. One way people often use the rule of thirds is they'll have one thing in the bottom row, one thing in the middle row, and one thing in the top row, or one thing in this column, one thing in this column, and one thing in this column, or they will have whatever their subject is be in one of the 4 points that intersect. So this is everything you need to know about your camera if you're a non-cinematographer. Next week, we'll talk about everything you need to know about lighting. Alright, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Follow me on social media. If you have a question, leave a comment below, and I will see you all next time.